was so good.
Yeah.
I hated it when Bob died. When Bob died.
I know, it was Bob. What the heck? They always kill characters off that we all like the most.
Seriously.
Character's named Bob, and he just haven't since he died.
What kind of
You
stuff
never
do you have?
read or watch a series. And
Okay, yeah, I can show you
Bob's a
how to do
character
it.
named Bob. They turn down.
Yeah, I can show you after.
So if you're feeling named you,
All right, so
Yeah, it's really, really good. I really enjoyed that.
what we're going to do, I'm just going to give you the overview for the rest of this, like till the end of the school year for what we're going to do with Bible study. I really don't want to break from Genesis right now, but if we go at our usual pace that our Bible study goes, we won't finish with Genesis till 3 years from now. So we need to do a little bit of an overview, because what I want to give you are the two most important stories in Genesis, in overview at least. And I say important from a Christian perspective, because one of them lays the foundation of our faith and the covenant that Jesus fulfills. The second one is the considered by the early church the clearest type of Christ in the Old Testament. If you know the book of Romans, you'll know that the word type is used by the St. Paul, and the correct opposite of it is the antitype. Okay? And you notice it's anti with an E, not an I. It might be an I, now that I'm thinking about it. Because what does anti with an E mean? Great scholars of language. Before. Yeah, it means before. Like antebellum, if you ever hear about the antebellum South. Bellum is the Latin word for war. So it's pre-war South. So it means pre-Civil War, okay? So the antitype is the opposite of the type. The type is, for lack of a better word, it's an actual historical preview of what God plans to do, okay? So in literary terms, it would be foreshadowing, okay? But this is actual stuff that happens in history. God lays out a pattern that he's going to later fulfill in Jesus. So St. Paul will refer to these as types and shadows. And he says it specifically so that when the real comes, you don't pay attention to the shadow anymore. So again, for those of you who spent a little time in Plato this year, right? Did you spend time in the Republic, the metaphor of the cave, right? There's shadows on the walls, like when you, well, for us old folk, when there were projectors in our homes. You know, someone turns on the projector and you do hand puppets and stuff like this when you're waiting for your dad to get done swearing at the film he's trying to feed through the thing.
I remember those in schools.
What's that?
Yeah.
We had them in schools.
Had it in schools too, yeah, exactly. So the shadows are, when the fulfillment comes, if there's real actors on stage, you don't pay any attention to their shadows, okay? You only pay attention to the shadows when that's all you have to look at. So what St. Paul is doing is talking about the fact that these types prepared the way. If he doesn't use this language, but essentially they form our imagination so that when Christ comes, we can understand what God is doing. If all that happened, if the whole of our salvation history was, let's say, the Gospel of Matthew, and what you have is Jesus does a couple of miracles, then he dies, then he rises again, okay, but we don't know anything more about what God's purpose is. Why did he need to die? What was the purpose of that? What does it mean that when he rises from the dead? All the stuff that makes up the church history that you guys have gotten a little bit in overview, and that has given us so much important theology over the years, and of course mistakes too, as people don't pay attention to this. A lot of missteps in theology have come from confusing types with the actual coming of Christ. So Christ fulfills all this stuff. So once Christ comes, once the real actor's on stage, you don't pay attention to the shadows anymore. But the shadows still helped us understand what was going to come. Okay, so obviously, when I'm talking about the covenant that Christ fulfills, who am I talking about? Which covenant are we talking about? Nope. There's a prophecy with Adam and Eve that gets fulfilled, but it's not a covenant.
Adam?
Nope, not with Adam.
Abraham, I'm sorry.
Abraham, yes, Abraham. So Christ fulfills the covenant made with Abraham. Okay? This is why St. Paul will quote Romans 15:6. He believed the Lord, and the Lord counted it to him as righteousness. Okay? So that's the covenant that's being fulfilled, is the covenant we're going to see when we get to Genesis 15. What's the most important type of Christ in the Old Testament? This is the full second half of the book of Genesis.
He's fine.
Nope. Good guess. No, the type is an actual historical event that tells us is going to prefigure the life of Christ. It's going to be like the life of Christ in miniature. So the whole second half. They did a musical about it. Not David.
Sorry, Joseph.
Joseph. Yes, Joseph. And if you've seen Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat.
It is the weirdest thing I've ever seen in my life, but it is awesome.
It is hysterical is what it is. It's very 70s. it's like the Bible meets disco. It's weird. But
Especially going to do Pharaoh.
Yeah.
Pharaoh was
yeah, or if you go down to Sight and Sound, you can they've often done the Joseph story down there where I saw that down there. So why would Joseph look like? Why would that be a type of Christ? Well, let's see. He's chosen by God out of 12. That sounds like Israel. Then he is unfairly stripped of his dignity and left for dead by the very people he's supposed to be a blessing to, his brothers. Gospel of John begins, he came to those who were his own, and his own did not receive him. Okay? Then, after living in dignity and everything like this, he saves all the people in spite of themselves. In fact, in the most famous, in the most important line in the Joseph story, as it comes to its final fulfillment, the line they left out of the movie when DreamWorks did it a couple years ago, and I cannot understand, like the writers must have had a complete tin ear for poetry. But he says to his brothers, when he's fully restored them, he says, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. And that summarizes the cross. It summarizes the cross for us, okay? So in order to get all this stuff in and not take 3 years doing it, what we're going to do is we're going to do Abraham before Easter. Then I'm going to go back to an old church practice. In the early church, when you became a Christian, you learned the story of Christ. You learned the significance of his life. You learned about Judaism. In your training, you were called a catechumen. Those of you who were in confirmation saw a very famous catechumen in Perpetua, whose feast day we just celebrated on Sunday. So you learned about all that stuff, but what you didn't do was experience worship. You didn't experience communion, and it wasn't explained to you it was going to happen. You didn't experience baptism, and it wasn't explained to you that it was going to happen. And you didn't experience anointing with oil, and it wasn't explained to you that it was going to happen. You learned who Jesus was. You made a profession of faith. Then, on the night you were baptized, you were also anointed with oil and given communion for the first time. And then, for the next 2 weeks, you would come to worship every night, and the pastor would teach you what you had experienced. Because the idea was that you couldn't, those of you who are from Baptist tradition, you don't use this language, you use the word ordinance, but Lutherans, Roman Catholics, Orthodox, Anglicans, Presbyterians, we use the word sacrament. And for those of you who are in confirmation, what are the two sacraments, please? Baptism and communion, thank you. Roman Catholics count 7, the Orthodox only count 1. We number them differently, but the word sacrament means mystery. Okay? So the idea was that you needed to experience a mystery before you had it explained. It wasn't, they didn't want the focus to be on understanding because none of us understand the sacraments. None of us do. None of us understand how Christ makes himself present to us in Holy Communion. None of us understand how we are united with Christ in his death so we'd be raised with him in his resurrection in the waters of baptism. Lots of people have taken a stab at it. Everyone's failed, at least partially. Everyone's gotten like part of it, and no one's gotten it completely. So the idea was what was important was that you experience union with Christ, not that you understand union with Christ. Understanding came later. So we're going to follow that same pattern for our Bible study. We're going to do Abraham before Easter. We're going to, all of us in our different church traditions here, we're going to experience worship of the crucified Christ. We're going to hear the stories of his crucifixion. In our church, we're going to hear St. Mark this year. Then we're going to move into We'll do that first. Then we will move into the rest of the Holy Week activities. If you have a church that celebrates all of them, including the institution of communion, right? The first communion is the night, the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, is the night before he's betrayed. Then we're going to celebrate his resurrection. After that, so for right after Easter, this Bible study will go back into the Passion stories, and we're going to look at one of them, and we're going to look at St. Luke's in detail. We're going to go back to St. Luke. We're going to finish out the Passion story and look at some of the details of it and the resurrection. Then we're going to end up the school year in Joseph, so you guys can see that type being fulfilled. All right. So I just want to give you guys the overview of what we're going to be doing, so it doesn't seem like I'm just randomly bouncing around. I just don't want to. I don't want us to completely miss most of Genesis because we're going in such detail on the coming stories. We've done what I'll call the prehistory stories now. That's lumping them together. I'm not saying they're not history. I'm just saying those stories come so fast at you in those first couple chapters of Genesis. Like, you get this one, and you get this one, you get this one, you get this one. Now, Abraham's going to take a long time to unfold, and Joseph's going to take even longer. So we're going to do those a little bit more in overview, and I'm going to encourage you to get the details of the story to read at home, okay? So, we were in chapter 12 or right at the beginning of chapter 12? We kind of skipped over the begots, right? Oh, and let's start with prayer. I jumped right into my overview and we didn't pray. So. Any special prayer requests today? We'll keep praying for our country, definitely. And I'll add to that, because of some of the things that are being considered by the Congress right now, our freedom of religion, our First Amendment rights to not only believe what we want to believe, but practice our religion the way we want to practice them. So, all right, let's pray. Lord God, as we come to your word this day, as we always do, ask for the power of your Holy Spirit to bless us and enlighten us. Bring us to a true understanding of the word, that we may obey it where we need to obey it, believe it as we hear of your promises made to us and the grace that only you can impart, and so be empowered to be courageous and live as your people. We pray for our country. We pray for actually the whole world that's going through a lot of conflict right now. And especially in our country, we want to pray for our ability to practice our faith without persecution, to say clearly what it is we believe and live it out. Ask you to bless us as we walk that long road, especially in the most difficult of commands to love our enemies and pray for our persecutors, should it come to that. Continue to bless us and make us your people, that we may have a Christ-like character. And this we ask in the precious name of him who is above all names, Jesus our Lord. Amen. Okay. And boy, it's gotten warm. Like, I can't do a sweater anymore. I'm like, all this year I've been cold in this room. Like, all of a sudden it's 50-some degrees outside. I'm like, okay, never mind.
When I leave Tip Thorpe, I'm in a winter coat, and when I get here, I'm like, oh.
It's spring, yeah. At least for 2 days. We're supposed to get 2 or 3 days of this, yeah.
Yeah, I think we're like 5 degrees. It makes a difference.
Oh, yeah, it does. Definitely feel. So I'm going to start us right at the beginning of chapter 12, okay? So, now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negeb. So let's focus at first on the first 3 verses, and then we can get into the last bit. So what grabs you here, this opening paragraph? You should have your Bible open in front of you.
Well, God is really blessing not just Israel or the Jewish people. He's really blessing all people
Yeah.
in the world,
Yes,
on the
absolutely.
earth.
Yep. Yeah. Through Abram, all people will be blessed. We talked a little bit about this last week. Abram is called the father of faith, not because he's an especially good person, but because he never deviates from his fealty to God. Okay, he's got feet of clay like many other people in the Bible. So, but he definitely has this desire to be faithful to God and not worship other gods. And God's going to bless the whole earth. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So even those who are not going to be his descendants, all the families of the earth are going to be blessed through Abram. This goes directly to what continues to be the Jewish sense today of their responsibility to the rest of the world. I've learned a great deal. I have a great Bible commentary on Genesis by a Jewish scholar, and I've learned a great deal from him about the way Jews see the world. And faithful Orthodox/conservative Jews today still see their primary responsibility as to be a blessing to everyone else. If you're a religious Jew, your primary responsibility is to bless others because you were chosen by God for that purpose. Of course, by the time of Jesus, what's happened, or during the period that Jesus lived, that had turned into a sense of, well, I'm really special and you're not. Okay? So that was a deviation from what this promise makes and what had been the historical understanding of Judaism. And that was in part a historical accident. The Phariseeism that Jesus was responding to in his day was largely a product of only the 200 years immediately preceding Jesus. We don't see as much evidence of that kind of splitting of hairs and weirdness in earlier Judaism. So it's an interesting reality that essentially the Jewish people had lost their calling. They had lost their sense of responsibility that flowed from this call of God. And now I'm using I'm using a theologically loaded word. The word call is very freighted language. What I just read in the Bible didn't use the word call, but the Latin word for this would be vocation. Usually we use the word vocation for a job to do in this day and age. But vocalize, voca, means to call. So God, what do you notice about this language from God? I'm calling it a call for a very particular reason. Do we have any indication here that Abram is worshiping God specifically when he gets this message? Later. He builds an altar later, but right at the beginning. All we get is God speaks. The initiation is completely on God's side. God is electing Abram. Abram's not seeking a special favor from God. Yeah.
Actually, I was going to say, Abram is not taking you in front and he just like, wait, what?
Yeah, exactly. God is completely in the driver's seat here. God is initiating this relationship with Abram. He's calling him out to do something. And what's his call? To be a blessing to all the families of the earth. Not only that, it's not for him to do it. I'm going to bless the families of the earth through you. So from the very beginning, God not only initiates, God is going to empower. There's a prayer that comes back relatively frequently in the Lutheran tradition. It's one of our sort of prescribed formulas, but it was at my ordination. So at my ordination, I make promises to, faithfully preach and teach God's word, to grow in my understanding of the same, to live a life that adorns the gospel with holiness. So the preaching of the gospel is surrounded by a life worthy of that. And then at the end of it, the bishop laid his hands on my shoulder and prayed, "May God give you the strength to do what he has given you the will to do." Okay? God's got to be the empowerer. Because none of those promises are ones I can keep on my own. Okay? There's sin, death, and the devil are gunning for me. I'm not going to manage any of those on my own. So here God wants to, he's going to bless him and make his name great so that he will be a blessing. It's not for his own benefit. The benefit God gives is always so that other people can be benefited. Okay? And some prosperity preachers miss this. God wants you to have a big field. Well, why? Even in the prayer of Jabez in the Old Testament, it's so that you can bless others. It's never for yourself, okay? Anything else grab you about those first 3 verses?
When it says that he will bless all the people here through him, it's kind of like how we have like how faith touches everyone whether they're aware of it or not.
Exactly.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Your faith is going to impact the lives of your friends who don't believe anything, whether they ever know it or not. Whether you ever get that opportunity or it seems like the right moment to share the story of Jesus with them, the fact that your character is being formed by your faith and consequently your choices are being formed by your character is going to make an impact on you.
Yeah, everybody's been touched by faith in one way or another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Is this just nitpicking? Or when he says, leave your country and your kindred, and then he takes Lot, who's his nephew. So he doesn't actually leave his whole family, or is that
You're
just
right, he
nitpicking?
doesn't. I don't know, he doesn't leave his whole family there. The Lord doesn't call him out on it, so I'm assuming what he's referring to here is you've heard that he's from the land of Ur, right, of the Chaldeans? That's where his father was. That was where his father was a what? Idol maker, right? At least according to the oral tradition. What, to this day, is the best possible thing you can use to preserve your wealth? Meaning, okay,
Have children.
that's certainly, okay, that's for your so you have a legacy, absolutely. But for you personally, if you start to acquire money, what's the best place for you to put money where it's most immune to the ups and downs in the economy? What we're likely to see over the next couple of years, if historical patterns follow true, this huge infusion of money that was just voted in with the COVID relief bill will juice the it'll juice inflation eventually, but in the short term, it's going to juice the economy so that it's like gunning your engine. Like when you're trying to pull out on the highway, you gun your engine to get around other cars or get up to the same speed as everyone else. If you keep your foot down, not only do you get going way too fast for the speed limit, but you also burn your engine out eventually. So historically what's happened is when you have a huge infusion of capital like this, the economy goes like this first and then course corrects and does that. So because the economy does this all the time, what's the best place to put, for adults? Probably knows, where's the best place to put your money to make it immune to this? They would not say that in the Weimar Republic. Gold is a good second. There's one that's even better than gold. Because you can't grow food on gold. Land, right? Land. That's the best possible preservation. And so all the wars that have ever happened in history have always involved trying to grab land, because land means natural resources and land means food. Okay? So what is God asking him to do? Everything that his father has acquired, I'm sure he's going to give him land, but does he see it yet? Yeah. It's not till he gets where he's going that God says, I'm going to give this to you. But he doesn't even know what that looks like yet. So he has to step out in faith right at the beginning on the very first call of God. When I was considering becoming a pastor on our retreat that we went on to do some prayer and discernment, one of the pastors, everyone was a little nervous and asking questions, and finally one of the older pastors, great guy, said, here's the way it works, folks. You can't cross a canyon in 2 small leaps. Bottom line. You either believe you're really called and you're going to jump out and hope God catches you, or you are not going to do this. There's no way to plan every step of this journey. So he's actually asking Abram to give up all of the most substantive bit of his property to move on. He's taking his flocks, but every place the flocks graze, he's leaving behind. So this is significant. It's a huge step that God's asking him to take right at the very beginning of their relationship. Right at the very beginning of this call. Because remember, Terah has just died. That's how we end chapter 11. His dad dies. Now you give up the family inheritance and follow me. So this is significant. He's risking everything here. All right. What else? Anything else?
Why is the whole line of whoever curses you out with her?
Ah. No, that's a promise of protection. Okay? Does it sound similar to any other thing we've had a promise in earlier in Genesis? Exactly. It parallels the promise to Cain. If we get far enough today, we're going to talk about a suzerain vassal treaty. But this is the great king promising to protect them. Now, a couple things that will be obvious to ancient Jews that are not going to be obvious to you today. All of you have picked up the fact that at this point it's Abram and Sarai, not Abraham and Sarah. Do any of you in your notes have what the name Abram means? This is just like, in the older films when you'd see like Native Americans and their name had a meaning. In certain nations, Native American nations, a young man would get a new name upon entering manhood that was usually based on something he did to acquire that status in the eyes of the tribe. Okay. These names have significance. So, does anybody have it in your little side notes or footnotes? Nope. Okay. Means exalted father. Which is highly ironic.
I was
since
going
he
to say,
has no
that sounds
children.
really ironic since he has no children.
Yeah, the older he gets, his name has got to feel very, very cruel to him. Okay, he's 75 at this point. He's going, father of what? Okay. Exalted father. Anybody have what Sarai means? I see not doing that one. Quarrelsome.
It's a very cruel name to give your child. Like, I expect you to be a terrible person.
Yeah, I don't know if that's one that was bestowed, maybe she was born Mary and they, at age 4, you're Sarai, you're done. We're going to call you, so yeah. But yeah, quarrelsome. So, as we're going to discover in very short order, Sarai is incredibly beautiful. Every place they go, men are trying to grab her and add her to the harem. So she's beautiful and she's quarrelsome. She's a diva. Okay, this is going to play in later in the story with her slave woman. Okay, and it's going to be significant why God changes their names. So they journey on from Ur, which, if you were looking at a map, would be up here in Persia, and they wander down to the Chaldeans a little further. From Ur, the Chaldeans, they're up here, and then they're going to wander down here to the Canaanites, the land of Canaan, which we call the Holy Land today. Okay, that's where the Canaanites were. So they're traveling southwest as they go. And when they get there, God says, this is the place, and he builds an altar to the Lord. Now notice, there's no fixed position for the altar. Altars are something you build on the fly as you go, okay? That becomes a conflict later in the Old Testament.
But at the end, he moves on.
He builds, what I have here is that he moves to the hill country on the east of Bethel.
But the very last verse says, then Abram set out and continued towards Negev.
Mm-hmm.
Is it just another community in the area?
Well, the Negev, of course, is a river and a desert. Okay, so he's still moving on in that area. So yeah, it doesn't seem that the Canaanites, we're told, are in the land, right? So these are the same people who a couple generations from now, when the Israelites leave bondage, they send them into the land that was promised to Abram, and they go, they're massive! We're not fighting them! Okay? So yeah, he keeps moving, but now he knows where his journey's going to end. Okay? And I've wondered a little bit, I don't know my Middle Eastern geography well enough, and I should have done a little preparation for this in this regard. Bethel, of course, means house of God. Okay? And And this is an example of something that will become important in the book of Exodus, especially, I think, for the dating of the Exodus narrative. It's a little, what's the word? It's asynchronous, it's anachronistic, that's what I'm looking for. It's anachronistic to refer to it as Bethel at this point, because it hasn't been named yet. It's called Bethel in the narrative because, anybody know?
That's how people would have understood where
People would have known where it was, exactly right. It's not named Bethel till Abraham's grandson comes along and wrestles with the angel and then names the place Bethel. So the people here are descendants of them. They know where that place is, but it's not actually named Bethel by the people who live there yet. Okay? Anything else grab you in this section? I'm sorry. Now this is where we're gonna be like a bit of a skipping stone here. So I'm gonna keep moving us along. You guys are gonna have to slow me down when you have questions because we have a lot to cover before we get to Easter. Okay.
What's the significance of the Great Tree of Morah?
This would have been a land. This would have been like a landmark that people would have recognized. If you've ever driven through Virginia, you'll see Old Man Mountain, Grandfather Mountain. Everyone just knows what it is. So the Oaks of Morah would have been a geographic fixture that everyone would have known where that was. Okay. Again, it's giving the hearers, like the word Bethel, again, which is anachronistic at this point, it gives them a sense of where they're at, where this is actually happening. Okay. All right. I'm going to go on at verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. That might be some reason why he moves on. We're not given that as an explicit reason why but why move into a desert when you're in a fertile valley? Well, maybe there's something, they're looking for food. That could be the reason. It's not clear that that's the reason, but that definitely marks our transition here. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram. And Abram had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. The significance of marking out male and female is that they can breed. That means you can get baby camels and baby sheep. Okay? Because it's a nice gift to be given a couple of goats, but if they're all female goats, it's not a lasting gift. Okay? So Pharaoh is dealing really well with her. I want you to be clear about this here. If Abram is 75 years old, his wife is 65. And they're adding her to the harem. Okay? Just so you're clear. That's how beautiful. And this
older women can be beautiful.
That's it. That's it. I said this is before plastic surgery, folk. Okay. So this is significant.
Is this the way things were at the time? If you had a beautiful wife, they'd kill you and.
Oh yes, very much so. It is. It was like that in many parts of the world to this day. There are just like there's while we're talking about slave reparations in this country, while slavery is still active in other parts of the world, and specifically race-based slavery in certain locales. So yes, the world was a very, very brutal place. But this also marks Abram out as two things. Yeah.
Hit the nail on the head with
Doing
that one.
something all for personal gain.
Yes. Well, that's true. It certainly marks out that he's not the most protective husband in that sense. I think it's fair.
That he doesn't trust God to protect him. He's going to protect himself.
It's interesting. Having done some Bible studies with some people from the Middle East, they never read it that way. Which is interesting to me. One of the things that's valued in Middle Eastern culture that we tend not to value, but actually remembering this helps you interpret some of Jesus' parables, like the parable of the shrewd manager, which is very confusing for people. Shrewdness is considered a virtue in Arabic culture. So this is, on the one hand, His wife is vulnerable. That's not something to admire. On the other hand, this is a pretty savvy move on his part. Like, hey, I'm going to live, and we're going to manage this. And I mean, she's still connected to me, and now we've got all these riches and blah blah blah. Okay, yeah. So it's hard for us to imagine that. What I'm trying to make clear is that people who originally reading this story may have been a little more okay with this move than we are going to be. Okay, because we're living after Jesus. Just to put it bluntly, we're living after the book of Ephesians says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, okay? That holds up one man and one woman as the way it should be. This is not the world they live in.
Yeah, didn't some of the greater people in the Old Testament, weren't they polygamous?
Oh, yes. Yeah, some were polygamous. And not far into, not a couple chapters from now, Sarah's actually going to suggest that Abraham by that point, go to bed with her slave, with her servant. So it's a different world than the world we live in this regard.
Well, Abraham doesn't trust God that much, does he?
At least, yeah. I mean, it does seem that here God has promised protection to them. It's like, I'm not sure I want to test that theory too much, so pretend you're my sister. Yeah,
Well,
definitely.
And in the opening, the idea that God has given him land to live in.
Mm-hmm.
And he has left that land and gone to Egypt, which makes you wonder, is there a moment where his faith is, he's no, I'm not sure God's really, he's given me this, but is really providing, I better go to Egypt.
Yes, I think that's a valid thing to think about. And it also highlights for us, again, why Abraham is the father of faith, is that it means that every little misstep in our spiritual journey doesn't imperil our relationship with God. He always stays true to God, even when he's not sure about God following through on his promises in any given situation. He never turns to another God for help. And I think that's important for us to remember in our moments of weakness when we misstep. It was certainly important to the early Christians. Those of you who were in confirmation on Sunday night saw the story of Perpetua. Well, that's that kind of thing where people are being, thrown to the wild animals or needing to, being used as cannon fodder for the games, happened again and again and again throughout Roman history. It was, and some people didn't stay true to their faith. They were still able to be restored to fellowship with the church. The church didn't forever cast them out because they didn't necessarily go and worship another god, but they did. They were still, that forgiveness sense of things allowed them to be restored through penance to the life of the church and the life of the beloved community. So, and it was a significant thing that the Christians did that. It was a really significant thing, and other people noticed it, that they were forgiving in that regard. So, okay. So now we're going to see that Abram's anxiety about God following through on his promises is misplaced. So, verse 17, but the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here's your wife. Take her and go. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Now notice, Pharaoh didn't take back all the gifts he'd given.
Pharaoh didn't kill him.
And Pharaoh
If
didn't.
you would lie to the Pharaoh, you would be dead.
You would normally think so, but apparently the plagues were bad enough that he was afraid of what God would do to him if he killed this guy.
It's like, okay, first of all, these plagues might not be taken away, and secondarily, they might get worse. I'm not going to risk that.
Yep. When we get into the early chapters of Exodus and we're seeing the people being taken by a different Pharaoh, being taken out of their slavery by God, that Pharaoh makes a different choice and tries to kill them all and loses his army for his trouble. So, yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. Oops.
Yeah, this particular Pharaoh is like, yeah, I messed up. You definitely messed up. Get out.
Yeah. I think it's important for us, especially with all the conversations our culture's having right now about equality and things like this, and they're all very important conversations to have. It's important for us to recognize how much less brutal the world is now, especially for women, than it was even 100 years ago, but certainly through the great swath of history. And really, I shouldn't just say for women and men. At the end of this story, if things had followed the usual thing, Abram would be dead, she'd be someone else's wife, but she'd still be alive. So it was a brutal world for both men and women to live in throughout most of history. And it's been a long, slow crawl to get away from might makes right, okay, bottom line. That's not to say there isn't room to grow and learn, and there's plenty that needs to be done. So I just think it's important for us to notice that as we're thinking about what equality looks like, to realize how far we've come in how short a length of time. That what year was the women's suffrage?
30s, early 30s.
1920.
I thought it was 1920. So we've just crossed the 100-year mark of women having a vote, and we've changed so much in 100 years. And in part, it wasn't just because men were trying to keep women down, although some men did that. It was because men were always running the risk of dying. Was why that was where it was going on. So it's been a long crawl to where we are as a culture, and I think we need to, as we evaluate what we want to do to keep improving things, we not throw too much away thinking that it was easy to get here. I think we need to make sure we're paying attention to evaluating carefully everything from history, and not just saying that's old, we throw it away, because there were a lot of lessons they had to learn to get us to where we are. I think this is just my personal perspective, and you guys can disagree with me. My personal perspective is more like the medieval church. In the medieval church, looking back at the apostolic and what's called the sub-apostolic period, right after the apostles died, people like Perpetua and Tertullian and Irenaeus and that crowd, the medieval theologians said, we are dwarves standing on the shoulders of giants. I think that's a wiser way to approach history. As you make changes that are undoubtedly necessary, to try and say, why did they do what they did, even if we think they were wrong? What can we learn from when they were learning? So sorry, that was a little digression. I didn't mean to take us down that road, because that's not exactly where we are in the Bible story here. So now we are going to have Abram and Lot separate, okay? So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negeb. Now Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and in gold, and he journeyed on from the Negeb as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning. So now he's made the journey from what we call the Holy Land down to Egypt and back, okay? Between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. So the same crowd is there who was there before. But now they've gotten so rich in Egypt, they've got a problem. There's not enough water and food to go around for all their flocks. And their underlings are quarreling. So, what grabs you?
It's kind of ironic that Abram was concerned that God would not provide enough, so he went looking for stuff on his own. And now God has given him so much that he has almost an excess of things.
Yeah. For those of you who lived through the 60s, it was a big thing to read Walden, right? That was, everybody was reading Walden at the time about how you're possessed by your things rather than possessing them. That there's some real insight in that. This is going to now fracture the family.
This is a good question. What does I mean in Hebrew?
I don't know. I have to look it up, and I'm not even sure that. I think I actually might be a Persian word, so it might be a different language group. I'm not positive though.
The funny thing about it is that I know that this has no bearing on what we're talking about, but I in Chinese means love.
Oh, cool.
So if you're taking parts from different languages, you have the house of God and you have love.
They live between the house of God and love. That's fun. I like
I
it.
just thought that was kind of a funny thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Just weird, random thought.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. Anything grab you about what we've read so far? All right, moving on. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered, everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now, the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. So we'll stop there. So what grabbed you?
I don't even think that's a little bit funny, where it's like, okay, you can pick either side, now pick the other one. He sees that side, looks amazing. It's almost like the fruit of the garden, where it's the tantalizing fruit that probably was not the best idea to take, considering about, how messed up that world was.
You okay there? Oh, that's okay. Nothing fell on my head.
It really is amazing that Sodom and Gomorrah was that messed up, with only like a single righteous person left.
Yeah, we'll get to that. we're not there yet. That's a couple chapters from now.
I understand that. I'm just saying that it's just amazing how wicked they were there. And
oddly enough, we're going to see how messed up Sodom and Gomorrah was after they're destroyed. Because
It kind of shows the difference to a certain extent in the personalities or the character of the two men.
yes, say more about that.
Well, Abram is he comes across as much more caring, and you pick what you want, and Lot comes across as being much more selfish, self-interested, and takes what appears to be the better.
Yeah, definitely. Now we know that Abram's shrewd, but there seems to be a value he places above shrewdness, right? Mm-hmm. And at the very least, it's going to be family. And family or maybe the integrity of the family, right? He doesn't want to have any infighting in the family. So that's a value he places above shrewdness. As shrewd as he might be, and we're going to find out, he is more than willing to haggle in a very short order. There's a very politically incorrect phrase they used to use, say that you can haggle like an Arab horse salesman. We're going to find out Abram can do that very, very well. He's very, very shrewd. But he places lack of strife in the family above that. Now, this is important. It's important for us. You've been hearing probably about identity politics and this kind of stuff where people's clan is more important. That's the history of most of world history, okay? The idea that individuals have a sort of value apart from their own clan, apart from their own family. Individual members are always valued, but there's always a sort of hierarchy to this. And family integrity is absolutely central to the culture in which Abram lives and to the culture he gave birth to in the Middle East to this day. Okay? Who you are the son of still makes a massive amount of difference, who you're related to. And this is gonna send him to war in a few verses here. So he's valuing family integrity about us, even to the point, as shrewd as he is, you take the better land. What does he think Lot's going to do? He said, you're at the hilltop, you look and say, there's the green stuff, there's the desert. Which way do I want to go? Of course Lot's going to take the better stuff.
This almost showed more faith that he's finally realized, oh yeah, God will provide for us. Maybe we should actually listen to him for once.
I think that's a great insight. I think I hadn't thought about that, but I think you're right. It's maybe he's starting to trust God's promises. It's going to be a little bit of one step forward, two steps back. He's going to make some more mistakes in that regard. But maybe that's what he's starting to do. Okay, God provided for me in Egypt. I came out rich. I didn't expect it. I was escaping a famine. I came out rich. Maybe I'll be all right.
Well, and he knows that God has promised him children. And I don't have any yet. So maybe he's figuring, God's going to protect me because he will carry out his promise of mine.
Well, so far we have that he will be a blessing to the nations, but we don't yet have the promise of a child. That's coming.
Oh.
That's going to come soon. But we haven't gotten there yet.
But he said you'll make him a great nation, so that almost means he has to have a child.
But that could be his family
it
group.
could be the family.
That's they form the nation. They could form the nation. Yeah, absolutely. God's going to elaborate his plan as he goes on. Go ahead.
If this really does demonstrate more faith in God than he'd had prior to, then it seems like he is very much like his descendants, the fact that he will randomly forget that God actually will provide for him, much like his people do, where they will forget what God has done for them within the generation that the thing was done.
Yeah, that is absolutely
I was
true.
astounded, especially with Gideon's story, where they basically had forgotten about it by the time Gideon had died.
Right.
I was just, my mind was blown by
Yeah,
it.
it's amazing the spiritual amnesia we have, you know.
Seriously.
There was a song back in the 80s, What Have You Done For Me Lately? And it's kind of like, I sort of felt like that's the theme of the people of God in the Old Testament. Like, what have you done for me lately?
Like, oh yeah, he could parse the Red Sea, make manna fall from heaven. I don't trust it. What?
There you
I
go.
don't get that.
Yeah. Yeah. So that, yeah, I think that's on a positive side. I think on a negative side, it's just something else. What does Lot do? Lot does pick the nicest land, but it's, now, we're not going to find out for several chapters why Sodom is considered so wicked.
Did they know it was wicked?
Yeah, I assume so, because that's why they have it there. I mean, that's meant to communicate that to us.
Yeah, and Lot knew the clue.
Yeah, so he's willing to have an unhealthy relationship, unhealthy neighbors, people who are dangerous to himself and his family for the sake of riches. So on the negative side, Lot's the one making a choice of, he picks the better land physically, but the worse land spiritually.
Or why did we move the tent closer to Sodom?
Yeah, yeah,
Was there
exactly.
no other?
Yeah, the whole Jordan Valley's in front of you, I'm going to Sodom, you know, yeah.
That'd be fun.
Exactly, yeah. So it's telling us something about Lot here.
Sodom? It's like a
Raucous
good
parties,
time.
I suppose.
What's
Yes.
that?
I said raucous parties, I suppose.
Yeah, let's
Yes. Yeah. Sodom was a bit like Las Vegas, right? What's done in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas or something like that, what they say.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have this sort of parting of the ways, and here now, after Lot has made his choice, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever." So Abram gave Lot the choice, and God's giving Abram even Lot's choice. All of it. From that high ground, everything he could see was going to be his. Okay?
It's like that scene in the Lion King. Everything that the light touches is our land.
There you guys, exactly. There you go. Yes, there you go. Perfect. Now here seems to be the first intimation of child, right? To you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. So you notice this, every time God speaks to Abram, Abram's building an altar. There's a wonderful hymn that we sing on special occasions around our church, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. Okay? The second verse is, Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I'm come. The Ebenezer was a stone of remembrance. But this is what, the placing of Ebenezers comes later in Old Testament history, but this is how the altars are serving to be. God calls Abram, he builds an altar. God gives him a new promise, he builds an altar. This is serving as markers of where God has done significant things in his life. Anything else grabbing you here? All right. So now you're gonna get a ton of names you mostly don't need to remember here in these next couple sentences. Go ahead.
More of the parasites, because they talk about the Canaanites and the parasites who were living in the land.
These are all family groups, probably the same or close to the same ethnicity as kind of like Anglo-Saxons. They were a combination of two originally distinctive ethnic groups, but they're certainly two language groups. So there's the Canaanite language and the Perizzite language are going to probably be related the same way that Greek and Coptic are related today, but they're living near each other, but they still consider themselves to be different. Almost in a way like how we sort of, and again, in a very anachronistic way, refer to Native Americans instead of talking about the Shawnee and the
Yeah.
Lenape and,
Native American.
Yeah, the Cheyenne. Yeah.
You're born in America.
Right.
Native American.
Right, yeah. No, well, yeah, I hear what you're saying, yeah, but I'm even talking about, we keep lumping this whole ethnic group together, and they considered themselves very distinctive. They waged war against each other, they conquered one another, they enslaved one another. They didn't see themselves as one group. What's that?
That does not sound like some kind of united nation.
Absolutely, yeah. And so this is reserving some of that. Of course, for the original people reading this, they would have known these ethnic groups. They would have known these language groups. So I'm going to see if I can plow my way through these names. Go ahead.
I would think that this would show you the power of God protecting Abram and Lot.
Mm-hmm.
Think of going into a new country and you taking over the best spots and you living in the best areas and you saying it's your land. You would think that people would rise up and want to kill them.
Well, they don't know that it's going to Abram yet. He hasn't exactly waged war and tried to claim the land. He's just walking it now.
But Lot went into the most fertile valley and he said, "This is mine," and he started.
No, he didn't say it was mine. He simply set up tents down there.
But isn't that encroaching? I mean,
It might have been.
Didn't people own land at that time like we do?
Not exactly. Most people were city dwellers. Today, most city dwellers don't own property. If you go to Manhattan, nobody owns property in Manhattan. It's too expensive. So it was the same way. Most people lived in cities because that's where it was safe. You lived inside the wall of the city to be safe. Remember, what is Lot? He's moving into the valley, but what does Lot do? He has herds. So he lives outside so he set up his tent near the city of Sodom. He hasn't moved into an apartment yet.
The concept of private property is a very, very recent
Very recent thing.
concept.
Yeah. Yeah, when you guys are going to be doing, I think, the Middle Ages this year a little bit. Yeah, when you have,
Correct in that now.
yeah, serfs don't own the property, they work the property.
The whole era of serfs is known as.
There you go, and that's the way it usually happened. Yeah, private property, you might be lucky to own your own, if you served in Genghis Khan's army, you might have your own bow. You know? You might have a horse that you preferred to ride because you've developed a sort of relationship with that horse and you could trust it, but you didn't own it. The king owned it.
It must have been a curious sight, though, for to have Lot, because it wasn't just, it had to be many more tents, because he had...
It was a whole family group.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, his servants and everything else.
And then all the animals.
Mhm.
So the people of the city must have been a little curious about this man.
Maybe, but it was actually fairly common. People were very migrant still at this time. Actually,
In such a large...
in large family
very
groups.
wealthy.
Yeah, until oil was discovered under the Arabian Peninsula in the early 20th century, there was this group called the Bedouins. Now we call them sheiks. Now they fly around in jets. 100 years ago, they were living in tents and moving around. Their family groups did. And what we call in America Islamicism or terrorism, the radical Islam, is actually properly called Wahhabism, and it has its origin in Egypt. The Saud family, for which Saudi Arabia is named, were all trained about the time of the American Revolution. They became adherents to Wahhabism, which is like being a Calvinist versus being a Methodist in Christian terms. They came under the influence of that particular version of Islam and then carried it with them back into the Saudi Arabian Peninsula because they were migrants. To this day, if you saw a couple of years ago, there was about 20 Christians were executed, had their heads cut off on the shores of the Mediterranean. Well, they were from Libya, but they were executed in Egypt because they were migrant workers. Just the way, like in America, we've had here on the East Coast, I don't know how it works on the West Coast, but there's migrant workers who travel and follow the crops, and they pick crops all year long, and then they winter over someplace south usually. So, in fact, that was the city of Gettysburg, town of Gettysburg, when I was living there. It didn't quite double. It was like a time and a half again in population in less than 10 years because migrant workers decided to start settling there. So the fastest growing churches in Gettysburg when I was there 15, 20 years ago were all all Spanish speaking. So that kind of nomadic lifestyle has been a fairly constant feature. So I don't know how. They saw, there's a new group at the side of the city. We better pay attention to them because we don't know them yet. But they seem to have a lot of flocks. Maybe they'll trade with us. So it was every encounter with another family group, another clan group, another ethnic group was both opportunity and risk. So it was a very, very back when I was in 8th grade, I had a very forward-thinking social studies teacher, and we the same way they have like model United Nations and stuff like that. We had to do a model landing at like some place. It wasn't Jamestown, but let's say something like that. And we had to, and we got ourselves killed almost instantly by trading out our guns. we traded a few guns with the natives, and they came and killed us. So it was like the experiment was over very, very quickly. So yeah, there's risk and there's opportunity. So you played it safe. So all right, so I'm going to try to plow through these names here to get us into the meat of this before we wrap up for the day. I want to end us with the rescue of Lot. In the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, oh, I sound like French. That can't sound like French, but however it's pronounced, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, these kings made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. And all these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. So you know where this is occurring, right? Now we know exactly where that is, near the Dead Sea. 12 years they had served, of course they had to give me the hard name, Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in Shava Kiriathaim, and the Horites in their hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran on the border of the wilderness. Again, these names would have been significant to you because you would have known these locations. For us, not so much.
But this is like.
This is just to see if I can tug. This is like reading Fox and Socks to you guys when you were little. It's just, for me, this is difficult. They turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, which still exists today, and defeated all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who were dwelling in Hazazon Tamar. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out, and they joined battle in the valley of Siddim with Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goyim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. So they served for 12 years. They decided they'd had enough. Now we're going to war. They formed an alliance. Now the valley of Siddim, that is near the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea, was full of bitumen pits. And as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, so they'd been routed, they lost, some fell into them, and the rest fled into the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom and his possessions, and went their way. So they've done the 2 things that always happen at the end of a war. They take the possessions, because this is how you raised an army. The modern idea of training a professional armed services didn't work, didn't happen until much later. Really, the Roman Empire really gets that going. Most armies were caused by, hey, you're a farmer, that means you know how to swing a hoe, that's your weapon, let's go, okay? So this is how armies were formed. You had some professional soldiers who surrounded the king. They became what we would call the officers, and they were running the general ground troops, which were made up of every man you could muster who was able-bodied, okay? So you collected their stuff, and you paid the army by giving them their stuff. The stuff, when you won, they got to take home the other guy's stuff, okay? Including their people as slaves, okay? Most slaves throughout history. What was unique about slavery in the Western Hemisphere is not that it existed. Slavery was a worldwide phenomenon throughout most of history, is that it was primarily racially aligned. That's what made it different. When Native Americans were enslaving Native Americans, they were relatively the same genetically and of the same complexion. It was when the West Indians and East Indian slave trades really got going, and they brought them into the Western Hemisphere, that we had, for the first time in history, primarily racially defined. It wasn't strictly racially defined. There were white slaves and there were Latino slaves as well. But you had that. And actually, the great majority of them were further south. Even though the United States ended up fighting a civil war over the issue, most of the slaves that were brought to the Western Hemisphere went into Central and South America. The great majority did. But so that made it a little bit different. So they've taken Lot, and he's going to be enslaved. Okay. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and Aner. These were allies of Abram. So here's the little group that are allies with him. Then when Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and the women and the people. So what do you get from that?
Interesting that they make a special
You okay, Chloe?
Yeah.
These masks make you sleepy. Go ahead, Elizabeth. Yeah.
Interesting that they make special notation of the fact that the women were also brought back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it means that they weren't just rescuing the men; they were rescuing the whole family. Absolutely, that's significant because the women would have been made probably sexual slaves, is such an equivalent. Some of them might have been married by the other men, but in all likelihood, they would have been servants under other women.
Well, Abram's family has become very strong.
Yes, absolutely.
But when you compare it to the four kings that he's attacking, it's a minuscule
Yeah.
attacking unit.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems he seems to be outgunned.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we don't know that he attacked all four of them together. I mean, the kings were they were done. They were all going home. We don't know if the whole army was still together, but certainly they seem to be outgunned, and they're still going for it.
It is interesting that they made notation of the fact that the men were trained and were not just random farmers.
Yes. Yeah, Abram's living. He seems to be still living in that sort of Bedouin lifestyle, that nomadic lifestyle, but he's training his men. They're not in the lap of luxury and doing it. So yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Barb.
No, I was just agreeing.
What else do we learn about him? Does he just attack him?
No, he makes him wise and when to attack.
Yeah, we're back to his shrewdness, certainly. I mean, he's a shrewd military guy as well as trying to survive in Egypt. I think this also establishes something else that the episode in Egypt didn't establish. The episode in Egypt would have pulled him off as a coward to me. But he goes in hopelessly outgunned for a rescue attempt. I think it also shows that he has courage. Again. So we're learning progressively about what kind of man this Abram is, even if he's not a moral paragon that we would like to see as Christians. I remember a friend, a colleague of mine, he told the story when his mom was quite old that she decided to read the Bible through for the first time ever. He was the president of his seminary. His mom's like, I gotta read the Bible. My son's the president of the seminary, and she calls him completely affronted partway through the book of Genesis. These people aren't even Christians. Yes, Mom. Yes, they weren't. Not only was Jesus not alive yet, but they weren't anything like the way we think of being moral. Yeah. But some of these basic fundamental character traits seem to be there. If you watch the Marvel universe, you've got all these anti-heroes. They would be good except for one fatal character flaw, and that makes them bad. Okay, or something like that, or some tragic backstory that makes them bad. But their courage is a good thing. It can be employed well or poorly, but it's essentially a good thing. So we're learning some of these basic characteristics about Abram. Anything else? Okay, that is where we will end because we're going to we're going to be encountering one of the most enigmatic characters in the Old Testament next week.